Grief is real, big, better shared. The podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear.
I'm Kevin Lee, President and CEO of Mid-America Transplant, and we are honored to sponsor this episode of Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared. At Mid-America Transplant, we have the privilege of working with families across southern Missouri and northeast Arkansas who make the heroic decision to donate their loved ones' organs or tissues. While donation often brings families comfort, they are still heartbroken by their loss. We are driven by compassion for these families and continue to walk with them through their grief journey. Mid-America Transplant provides several programs to help families memorialize their loved one, but we believe that some of the best support can be provided by a grief center. We are proud to work with the Center for Good Grief and appreciate everything they are doing in the region to bring healing to people who are coping with loss. Mid-America Transplant is inspired by life and by the donor families who give transplant patients a second chance at life. For more information about being a donor, visit sayyesgivelife.org.
Hello, welcome to Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared, the podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear. I'm Angela Hamblin-Kelly, the administrator of the Baptist Centers for Good Grief, and we're so glad that you are tuning in today. If this is your first time checking out our podcast, please know that we have Season 1 available wherever you get your podcast. In Season 1, there's a lot of great content about grief in general, about spouse loss, men in grief, and important things to know about childhood and adolescent grief. So make sure you go back and catch up on those episodes. With Season 2, we've heard from you and we listened to you, and we're going to focus more on some specific topics in a very short format. Just as a reminder, the Baptist Centers for Good Grief has been providing grief care for over 25 years. We've grown from a children's grief camp to a program with 3 comprehensive grief centers in Tennessee and Arkansas. We started this podcast because grief is the most universal experience there is. Again, this is the podcast everyone needs to hear because grief involves pain and vulnerability, which is also why this is the podcast nobody wants to hear. So I sit here today as a grief counselor, but I'm also a griever. So in our podcast, we hope to honestly look at grief and discuss the heart and head tug of war from an evidence-based grief counseling perspective, but also the very real-life perspective as well. So joining me today is Traci. Traci, thank you so much for being here with us. And we just appreciate you being here and sharing your story. You know, this podcast title is Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared. And we know that there's so much value in sharing. And sometimes, you know, there's value in hearing from the grief counselors and what we know to be true about grief and our experiences. But it's the real stories that I think most listeners want to hear. They want to know how you grieved, how you survived, and what maybe they can learn from your story to help them grieve. And so that's where that better shared. So thank you for being willing to be here today to share that with us. So as we get started, Traci, I'll just turn it over to you. You know, what would you like to tell us about you and maybe your journey to the Centers for Good Grief?
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much for having me, Angela. I came to the Centers of Good Grief, I guess, starting in March or April. And I guess just to rewind, I lost my mother in August of 2022. And so we're coming up on a year as we're recording this. And but prior to me coming back to Memphis is my hometown. So in 2019, I ended up moving back. My mom was starting to show more signs of cognitive decline, specifically with dementia. And, it's just my brother and me. And so my brother has a family, a wife and kids. So, I am single, unmarried, and no kids. So it just sort of made sense for me to be the one to come back. So I was living in New York City at the time. Actually, I sort of made the decision in April of 2019, and I was back by June.
Oh, wow.
And so it's just an interesting story. My mom had dropped me off at the airport. I'd been home for Easter. And by the time I made it back to New York, she was just getting home. She had gotten so turned around.
Oh, goodness.
And so, I had my aunt sort of on red alert. I was just like, it's really weird. By the time, normally I get through security, we don't live too far from the airport. She hadn't gotten home yet. And I was just like, that's really bizarre. Mm-hmm. And so that was sort of the first thing. And I was at work that following week. And I was talking to my brother, and I was just like, I think I got to do it. And I was just in a conference room. I was looking out, a beautiful view of the city. And I was like, it's time. Like, no matter how much I'm in love with New York City, I got to do what's right. And so ended up moving back in 2019, had a great 3 years with my mom. And then in August of 2022, she had a pulmonary embolism that moved to her heart. And that was on the 17th of August. And by the 28th of August, she was gone. So thankfully, she held on for, that week and a half almost. Everyone in the family, got to say their goodbyes, which I think was really special. And we all got to share with her, how much she meant. Mm-hmm. And I do believe that, she was able to hear it all.
Yes, yes.
And so, so that's sort of what happened with my mom. Mm-hmm. And like I said, I'm just really thankful for those 3 years, especially during the pandemic, although I definitely think that's part of my grief story, becoming a caretaker, just before the pandemic hit.
Yes.
It was very different. So while it was, some great times, there were also some rough patches where I was just like, what am I doing with life? And, but now I look back on it and I think it just all makes sense. Mm-hmm.
So just a couple of things I want to say there, just when we think about grief, sometimes people will say, well, it starts maybe when your mom died, but your grief story, it started really in that conference room, or maybe even sooner, but I heard it in that conference room, like looking out over the city and knowing I'm changing the direction of my life. And that's a loss. I mean, all the things you had to say goodbye to, even though you wanted to be with your mom, it sounds like that was a choice you were content with making, but there were also goodbyes in that choice.
Absolutely. And you know what? I don't know that I've ever really thought of it that way, but I absolutely think you're right. I was in the process of me, doing this really quick move because I know she needed it. I also am now realizing, or maybe I think there was some realization at the time, but I was also grieving my life.
Yes.
I had been in New York at that point for just shy of a decade. So that's a pretty long time. And then before that, I had been in other cities. So I hadn't lived at home in, a very long time.
Right.
And so it was an adjustment for me to make that change, sort of losing my independence. It was sort of, I was just like I remember calling my brother one day and sort of just being like, this is my life. I'm back in my childhood bedroom with, a canopy bed, like a twin canopy bed. Like, what is happening?
Right.
And so you're right. There was some grief that went along with the move as well.
And then to be a caregiver, I mean, I preach this all the time, but that is one of the hardest jobs there is. And it is a job. And even if it is for someone you so much love, your mom, but it is a job. And so it's like you were changing so many hats professionally, personally, and stepping into this role as caregiver. And then, like what you said, with the pandemic as well.
Exactly. So, and being in the role of caretaker was one that I hadn't had to be in. My dad, who passed in 2014, my mom was still very much herself at that point. And so she took on the brunt of that. And so, it was a totally different, and also being a caretaker in isolation. Was completely different. And my mom is very strong-willed, or was very strong-willed. I still speak of her in the present tense, but
sure you do.
And then, with her dementia, it wasn't so progressed that, she didn't have a lot of executive functioning, but she could still do lots for herself. and so there were very much, she could push back now in a way that only a mom can.
Yes.
And so that was difficult as well. Like, even though sometimes I felt the roles of, who's the parent, who's the child were a little reversed. But, don't get too ahead of yourself,
Right.
because she's going to remind you.
Right.
So those were fun times.
And such a tightrope, because the days were probably very different. And like you said, the roles were changing. But then still there were days when, I am the mom and she was the mom.
Exactly.
And that's a roller coaster ride in itself.
Exactly. So, there were some days that it was just like, okay, I'm going to need a timeout. So I'm going to go to my room, or I'm going to go upstairs. You're going to stay down here. Your meals are ready. Do what you got to do, but I'm going to need a break. So, yeah.
And I have to also just say, being back in your childhood bedroom, I've heard that from so many people. I even have a little of that in my own narrative. I felt that of these moments when you come back home to care for someone. And that's a very weird thing as such an independent adult, but then also a family member.
Yeah. So, like I said, it was just, I would just sort of look around sometimes and be like, there was so much that I felt was going so well in my career and my, just life in general. And then to be back in the four walls that you grew up in, it's just like, man, well, this is very humbling.
Yeah. But it sounds like you could lean into your brother a little bit about that. I think that's important.
Yeah. And, but, it's interesting because while I did lean into him a lot, and I think I've shared this with him as well, in a way, there was a little bit of resentment as well.
Sure.
And maybe if he listens to this, he'll realize how much I was sort of in I want to say a little bit of a dark place for a while.
Sure.
Where I was not just resenting him, I had some resentment towards my mom.
Absolutely.
Which, and just to put that out there, then I think there's guilt later. Now that she's gone, I'm just like, maybe I didn't show her I cared enough, or maybe there were times where I let the situation get the better of me. So I was just like, man, he gets to live this great life and have all this freedom, and I'm here, making doctor's appointments, being, the chauffeur, being the chef, being the,
punching bag.
Yeah.
It sounds like sometimes.
Being the cleaner, like literally doing it all. Actually, funny. My mom's nickname, after I moved home, I started calling her Baby Hands, because when I tell you there was nothing that she picked up that was a cleaning supply, a knife to chop a vegetable, like she's sort of interesting. The day before, she went into cardiac arrest, she was painting her nails and she's like, Traci, just look at my nails. They've gotten so long. And at the time I was like doing something else. And I was like, well, it's probably you're taking vitamins, you're eating better now that, you're getting full meals. And she's like, oh, I thought you were going to say it's just because I don't clean anymore. And so, but that was all part of it. And like some days it would be, we take an ingest, but then other days it was just like, if you don't help me do something.
Right. Well, I think that speaks to the very important nature about feelings. And I think as people, we don't think about this very much, but the capacity that we have to feel more than one feeling at a time. And so even though you made this choice, you wanted to be here, you wanted to be with your mom. So that's one part, but there's another feeling in there of maybe resentment, like you said, and that as humans, we feel more than one feeling at a time. And it's very confusing because they're usually conflicting and all over the place, but we do. And I mean, I heard that in you, and I felt like that we definitely had to give that pause of that ability that we have.
Absolutely. So yeah, there's definitely, a juggling of two, I don't want to say personas, but there's just this dichotomy that I was having to process as well. So absolutely.
I wanted to also just comment on, caring for your mom with kind of this very long-term illness that was before you. And then it it shifted quickly, it sounds like, into, oh, this is more sudden, this is more acute.
Yeah, so we had started to notice some signs actually, even when my dad was sort of in his last days. But it wasn't anything so great that I think either my brother or I were alarmed about necessarily. And, you know, I will say that, you know, just, you know, as I would get older, my mom became more of a friend. And so she's that person, like I honestly called my mom 2-3 times a day. So also because I was talking to her so regularly, you know, I didn't really notice signs, but it was also you're talking to someone regularly. And I think, honestly, I do think people who are experiencing cognitive decline can mask it very well.
Yeah.
And so even when we would come home for holidays, there was still, you know, an ability to keep up a front. And so, but it was that last visit, that Easter of 2019, where I was just like, no, this is more. It was like the house wasn't as well kept as it normally was. And it was just like there was more that she couldn't put a Band-Aid over.
Right.
And I was just like, okay, this is alarming now. This is a big deal that we have to actually address. So
Right. And then the shift with her cardiac and that pulmonary embolism, and then all of a sudden, you know, we maybe don't have the time we thought we had. Is that how you would describe that time?
Absolutely. Yes. She never regained consciousness after that. So it was clear, not immediately, but it was clear within the first 24 hours. You know, we'd gotten her to the hospital, and, you know, the doctor, I had finally gone home like wee hours of the morning. And the doctor called and was just like, you've got to get back to the hospital. I've got to, you know, I need to share some things with you. And it was just the tone. And initially he hadn't been able to reach me. He had to call my aunt. I was in the shower. And when my aunt then called and said, did you check your voicemail? And then I listened to it, and then I called back, and I was just like, okay, this is not good. Yeah. So, yeah.
Did that start playing in your head? Did you?
Yeah. And my brother, of course, you know, he lives in Connecticut. And so I called him. Well, I had actually called him when the paramedics were at our home. And, but I was just like, I think this does not look good. Right. And it was clear at that point that, you know, she had been without oxygen for too long. And, that she was probably not going to regain any functioning. Brain functioning was pretty much gone at that point. And so, of course, we wanted to make sure we ran all tests in before, you know, our brother and I ultimately had to make the decision to take her off of life support. And then after she was taken off, it was a week. It was Sunday, and we took her off on a Sunday, and it was the following Sunday that she passed. So, yeah.
Some long days there in between. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, tell me about your mom, just, you know, pre you coming back to Memphis, or even just your childhood. How would you describe your mom?
The life of the party.
Okay.
So she was a force.
Oh, I love that.
Man, she could light up a room. She could, you know, smile that's just effervescent. She was an educator for 31 years. So she touched the lives of many Memphis City School students. She was the first in her family to go to college, which was a big deal.
Yes.
And I think changed the trajectory of our entire family. Pretty much everyone, you know, after my mom went on to get a college degree. Not saying that that's the end all and be all, but I do think that it changed our lives in a very impactful way.
Of course, yeah.
And she, anytime anyone was in need, she had this thing, getting fruit baskets for people, like having fruit baskets made, or baking one of her famous pound cakes. And she's just, I don't even know if that even does it justice, but she was one of one.
Well, I definitely hear the force. I love that you use that word to describe her, because just being an educator that long, being that presence for children, but then how you described about changing the trajectory for your family and herself with her own education. I mean, I hear force for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
She was truly a remarkable woman,
Right.
and also just beautiful inside and out.
Are you still in that childhood home?
I am.
Okay.
And so actually, speaking of education, when she passed, I was in my last semester. I decided to start another master's program. So I was getting a master's, and I'm actually going to be starting my doctorate in the fall.
Excellent.
And
Wow.
so I think that she would be very proud. And so while I do that doctorate program, I'll still be in my childhood home, which, ups and downs with that.
Ups and downs.
Yeah. I think that I and I know it's I'm sure you probably won't be surprised by this, and maybe people listening won't either, but I truly feel my parents' presence in that home. And so one, I'm thankful to be there, but two, I'm also almost scared to have to part with it.
Sure.
Which I know I will at some point. But yeah.
Yeah. That can definitely, I mean, I've talked with so many people, even, in my own narrative of saying goodbye to my childhood home, it is another loss. It is, because there is, there can be comfort, there can be all the feelings in our childhood homes, based on all the memories, but it is something that definitely needs time and attention. And I've had people say, well, it feels so weird to say goodbye to a thing or a place, but I'm a big believer in doing that and walking through the rooms and sitting with those memories and recalling things and touching doorknobs or walls or windows or, I think that's really important. But yeah, I think that'll be another, sometimes we call them like chapter titles of your grief novel, you know. So.
And it's funny, I actually still talk to them. I say good morning every morning.
Yes.
And I tell them good night.
Yes. I love that you say that out loud, because that is something that we have to tell people is okay. Sometimes people I can tell sometimes they'll get a look on their face like they're not sure if they can tell me that. And I actually had somebody ask me recently if it was healthy or if it was unhealthy, or no, she said harmful. And I said, no, that is really healthy. Keep doing it. And the relief washed over her, just like, okay, thank you. Because if you told me that was harmful, I didn't know what I was going to do, because it feels good. But it may sound, you're right. Like a non-griever may be like, oh, you maybe need to go talk to a counselor about that. But it's an act of mourning. And that's what we want people to learn how to do, is to actively mourn.
Yeah. Well, I am actively
good
still, mourning them. And I also think that whenever I do move on, I think they'll be with me still.
Right.
So.
Right. And those are the things, I think, when we do actively mourn and we take the time, then that we can get to that point. We can realize that it's not really these four walls I need. Yeah. The four walls are nice sometimes, but they're not just in these four walls.
Right. And that's one thing I'm really still grappling with, even like, some of my dad's old belongings and definitely my mom's things. Pretty much nothing in my mom's bedroom or the bedroom that, she and my dad shared. I've not touched anything. But I know that some of it is that I look at some of the things sometimes and I'm just like, I do think these would still be, like, someone would gain so much value from her clothing or, there's so much in there in that house itself that I just know could be put to such good use.
Yes.
And so that's one thing that I'm having to grapple with, but also come to terms with.
Yes.
That way I can start to let go of some things now.
Yes.
As opposed to when it is time for me to move in the next like two years or so.
Right.
And I'm not having to do it all at once.
Those are great points that you said right there, because first, when people talk about the stuff a lot, these are conversations we have. And there are some people who think, I'm just going to attack the stuff immediately and quickly. And that usually doesn't go well for people. It's hard to see the stuff sometimes. So sometimes I'll say, it's okay to shut a door every once in a while if you need maybe just like a little bit of a break. It's still there. But I think when people can take time with the stuff to do just what you said, like there is still value to get from some of this stuff from someone. Someone can still use these clothes. We don't want to just pack them up and throw them away when they could be helpful to someone.
Absolutely.
And I think when you take your time and you pace yourself with that, you'll make good choices for the stuff, but also good choices that feel right to you.
That timepieces is exactly what it is. Like, not rushing myself. And that's actually part of just randomly what brought me to the Good Grief Center. So she passed in August. I was in my last semester of school, starting that, September, which ended, at the end of the year. And so I think it was March. I was just having a moment where I'm not even sure what set me off, to be exact. And it just felt like I was understanding for the first time that she wasn't coming back. And sort of the pain that I felt was so intense. And it was tears and just like in the depths of my soul.
Yes.
And I was just like, a good amount of time has passed. I was like, why am I feeling like I'm just learning that she's not going to be here anymore? And actually, finally pulled myself together. It was about 45 minutes to an hour of really just deep, soul-wrenching tears. And I just started Googling therapy. And the Centers for Good Grief came up.
Good.
And I called, and I remember even the receptionist, whoever answered my call, if you can go back and listen to the recording, whoever she is, thank you. She was so just gracious and kind.
That's so important to us. Thank you for saying that. But that is, even just from that first point of contact, is so important to us, because we know it takes a lot of courage to pick up that phone. And a lot of times it's following some gut-wrenching moments,
And I was still sort of in the midst of that. And I think she could feel that. She could sense that. But she was right there with me. And that also made me know that I was in good hands.
Good.
And it made me feel good, because I had never really reached out. I probably should have reached out for therapy long ago, even before, the loss of my parents. But, you have to do things in your own time.
That's right. That is absolutely
and which is sort of how I got here, just the time piece.
Right.
But it made me also realize that my timing was perfect in having reached out, because I could have reached out before and maybe gotten a totally different, resource.
Right.
And it may not have been as helpful or as impactful, but I feel like, for me, I feel that God was directing me in that moment, and I got directed to the right place.
Good. I'm so glad. And I think too, it just takes so much courage to seek help and seek support. And, grief can make us feel so many different things. We've talked about that on this podcast, because we grieve in 5 ways. And you mentioned just even how you were feeling that physically, emotionally, but it's also that intensity sometimes that is just so terrifying to people, because it's like, I've never felt this deep, to my soul. How you describe that.
Yeah. And I don't even know that I felt it that deeply right after she passed. I don't think I felt it that deeply, when my dad passed. And actually going through the therapy actually helped me realize that I don't think I ever properly grieved my father.
Sure.
And so I think that guttural pain that I was having was me feeling the loss of both of them.
Yes.
And so
that definitely can happen sometimes, where one loss brings back, especially if maybe we didn't have a chance to fully grieve and mourn for a million different reasons. Or also, I think an important point to say here too is when both of our parents have died. There is a sense where so many adults will say, like, I mean, I don't have parents anymore. I'm an orphan. Whose child am I? Mm-hmm. And that's a weird thing because we come into this world with our parents. Mm-hmm. And then to be at a place where they're not here, even though we all know intellectually, if things happen in a timeline appropriate way that we feel that things happen, people get older and they die, it still doesn't mean we're ever ready for it. And we don't ever know what it's like to be in this world without parents.
Yeah. And that what you said about sort of feeling like an orphan. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think for me, because I don't have my own family necessarily, I think it was a bit different for me than maybe it even was for my brother. I don't want to speak for him by any means, but there was a loneliness and a sense of just being alone, which I think are a little different, but that were overwhelming. And so, yeah.
I think, too, from that caregiver standpoint as well, when you become a caregiver, and sometimes that takes a while. So kind of your timeline, I kind of think, well, I could get that from that caregiver standpoint, that there's so much exhaustion that sometimes it's kind of like you're just in a fog for a little while. And then when that fog starts to lift, or you get some rest, because maybe as a caregiver you haven't had a lot of rest, and then it hits you. And that can be confusing to people. People say, well, it's been 6 months. Why all of a sudden?
Those were almost my exact words. I told the person who I spoke with that, it's been, at that point, it may have been like 5 to 6 months. And I was just like, I am not sure why I am having this reaction at this moment. I don't know. And, but, there's no linear path to grief as my therapist through the Good Grief Center taught me, and the group grief counseling that I received. Everyone has a different journey. And how they say there are stages of grief, and it's just like, it's so neat. You go through each one and then you're done. Absolutely not.
I wish.
Yeah, I wish actually, you know what? Yes. That would actually make it so much easier.
Oh my gosh, so much easier. Right.
But it's absolutely not how it works. You can be in a stage and then feel like you're going right back to anger. Right. Or for me, there were a lot of deep, dark, sort of depressive days and weeks and months. And just feeling like I'm in this all by myself. And I don't feel any end in sight. Yeah. So.
When you talked about, you are approaching the year anniversary, and a lot of times special days as we approach those and anniversaries, sometimes people will say, I feel like I'm going backwards because that intensity picks up again. I was just curious if that's kind of where you are.
Absolutely. And I've gotten a little teary a couple times just sitting here, and which I haven't in a while, but I actually do think that it's because, all of these pivotal days are coming up in a row for me. So, the death of my mom, which actually is just right with my birthday, which sort of makes my birthday not really feel the same. And then, then her actual homegoing ceremony or and burial were on her birthday.
Oh, wow.
And so, I guess in a way that's like a full circle moment for her, but then it also makes her birthday feel like a dual bittersweet kind of day.
Sure.
And then the following month, my dad passed in October, and then I've got the holidays coming up. And so it's a challenging season. And, I feel like after we get through Labor Day and it's sort of all downhill in terms of the year sort of starts to go that much faster. I actually saw pumpkins out at Kroger.
Oh my goodness.
I'm just like, it's August.
Settle down, everyone.
I know. So it's just like, I feel like the days all sort of start to speed up.
They do. Yeah.
So the holidays and a lot of pivotal days for my parents are coming up, and so I'm bracing myself in a way, but I also feel that I have been more emotional. Actually, I was going through some paperwork that, just trying to figure out what I need to shred. And I just had a moment, and I just was just like, I can't do this right now. And I just had a breakdown. And just those crying bursts and crying fits, which thanks to Christy, she assured me that they were okay.
That's right.
And they are okay.
Right.
And so I felt what I needed to feel. I let it work. I washed my face with cold water, and I was able to go on about my day. So
that's good. It's good that you can lean into those moments, because we know that if we don't, that grief will build inside of us and it will come out. And a lot of times it's coming out in a way that's maybe harmful to us through, an illness, or, our body's reacting and telling us, hey, there's a lot of pent-up grief and stress in here. And so we do need to let it out. It doesn't feel good usually when it happens. Sometimes we're not prepared for it. As people, we tend to kind of want to have control over those moments, and those moments often just come, when you're looking at papers, or something just strikes you, a memory comes. And if you can sit with it and allow yourself, but then, like you said, go wash your face, put some cold water, and then, okay, I've allowed myself this moment of grief. Now I need to go do this. We actually call that dosing a grief. And, and again, it's another very healthy thing. It just takes time and attention. Yeah. Well, as you are approaching these days this year, I'm sure, are you experiencing your brain kind of like, well, what were we doing this time last year? What was happening? Do you find those thoughts creeping in?
Interestingly enough, the 17th, which is the day that, she went into the hospital, for some reason I am dreading that day more.
Okay, yeah.
And I'm not even sure why exactly. That's something I might need to process. But yeah, it feels like that's the day that the first domino fell in a way.
Yeah.
And
it's the day that changed
It's
everything,
the day that
like.
Changed everything. Yeah. That's a perfect way to put it, Angela. And
Yeah.
so I think more than anything, that's the day that I'm in a way trying to wish away.
Yeah.
But I know it's coming. So.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because sometimes people, and sometimes our support people, will remember important days, like, oh, I need to call her or text her on the anniversary. But for a lot of people, it's a different day than the actual death day, especially if there was a hospitalization or a surgery or things like that. And so I think that's an important point to let people know, that it's not just usually, birthdays are special and date of deaths are special, but there's usually these other days in there that kind of come with a punch as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's interesting, because I don't want to say that I have not leaned on my family, but I am also just cognizant that, I know they feel and they miss, her. But I think it's also that experience when you're so deep in your grief and you're experiencing the loss in a way that other people may not. And then, there's sort of the, after everything is, or in the midst of everything happening, and, preparing for, a funeral, and, there's so many people present, it's almost like all hands on deck.
Right.
But then it's just like the next day.
Yeah.
It's like there's no one.
Right.
And so I don't want to say that. Well, actually, there was a little bit of that. I think my aunts were still really, really pivotal, because, that was their sister. So, they've known her longer than I have. And so I think that I definitely could lean on them. But for the most part, I felt like everyone else had sort of moved on with their lives.
Absolutely.
And in a way that I think added to my sense of loneliness.
Yes.
And so, and then grief is one of those things that, can be very awkward.
Yes.
I think,
Yes, such a good word for it.
Yeah,
Yes.
and it's awkward for sometimes it can be awkward for the person who's grieving the most because you're just like, I would like for you to say something, but I'm not exactly sure what you should say. Or thank you for the offer of whatever you're offering, but I just sort of want to be left alone.
Right.
But I also then would like for you to maybe call me tomorrow.
Right.
But, and then that doesn't happen. And so
Right.
it's just like,
Yes.
you don't know how to reach out to people and you don't know what to ask for. And then you feel like you've missed your window for asking for help.
Right.
I don't even know if that makes sense.
No, that does. I was actually just talking with some people today who are like, help us know how to support her. And that's basically a lot of what I said is like, look, there's no real manual. You just got to keep showing up because there are going to be some times when she gives you the signal that she wants nothing. And then other days she's going to need it, but then she might be afraid to ask you because she didn't need help the last time. And, you know, you just got to keep showing up. And that's one thing that I've talked about with a lot of clients is that in the very beginning, there's a lot of people. And then they slowly kind of, it starts getting smaller and smaller. And who are those people that, you know, kind of walk with you through this, through year one and even into year two? I mean, it's usually a smaller group of people. And part of that is, you know, the world does move on, but when you're a griever, you are in just concrete. You're not moving. And it feels like the world's even, I think, moving faster around you. And you're looking like, well, who's doing this with me?
Yeah. There was definitely a sense of like just being stagnant. And then I sort of realized, well, life is going on about me, around me, and just everyone seems to be doing more than I am. But I also just was just like, I don't have the bandwidth.
Exactly.
I just didn't feel like I had the bandwidth for anything. And some days, even now. And my brother actually had just a really transparent moment. He's just like, I actually just don't really feel like anything matters.
Yeah.
And that was several months ago that he mentioned that. And I was just like, I'm right there with you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point because a lot of times when someone dies, you know, we lose this person we can see, touch, and feel. But until you're kind of wearing the shoes, as I say, you know, you've been given the grief shoes, you don't really realize there's this loss of self. So we talked about that, like, you know, this loss of identification of someone's daughter, you know, or parents. There's loss of security, which that can mean your physical security, your emotional, financial, those things. But then there's loss of meaning. And that one, I think, sort of takes a little bit longer into grief sometimes to get. But that's what I just heard you saying, that you and your brother, like, what's the meaning and purpose of any of this? You know,
I think I'm starting to regain some of that.
Good,
especially as I sort of, you know, step into this next phase of my education, and just knowing how I think proud my parents would have been. But I think some of just that loss of purpose and meaning. Also, it's sort of, for me. And not that it should be tied up in this, but my mom was sort of my last real cheerleader. You know, that person who just, no matter what it is that you want to do or choose to do or, you know, want to put your energy into, she's going to be right there. Like
100% no agenda other than you.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that's, I do feel like I've lost that.
Sure.
And so I think that is why I'm just like feeling a little bit of just almost being ambivalent about things. Or I was very ambivalent about life. I don't want to say things. It was like life itself.
Yeah. But I hear you say, like, you feel like you're kind of feeling some of this, like, meaning sometimes, or hope again, things like that. And I just have to stress, I think that comes to those who embrace the grief. Even though I don't want it. Because remember, I think embracing it means also knowing when to put it down through that dosing we talked about. But people who really do their grief work can get there. You know, I was talking recently with someone about borrowed hope. You know, I think for a while, that's what we hope our clients do from us, is when they don't feel hope, they can borrow it from us, because why else would I be a grief counselor, or my colleagues, we've all been there for a very long time, be able to keep coming back if we didn't see that.
Mm-hmm.
But that is unique to everyone. Everyone has their own journey, their own time. But we like to, I think, serve as people who can allow people to borrow hope from us.
That's a great way to put it. And I do think that when I finally did go in for my individual counseling sessions, I think that I did get a lot of that from Christy. And it made a huge difference, because I realized that I wasn't alone,
Right.
because I was still having a lot of just grappling with this sense of loneliness. And it was just nice to know that I could lean on someone else a little bit. And I could also share with someone who, maybe wasn't as entrenched in it as I was at the time.
What do you wish that you had known in those early days? So the other part of that question is, what do you think it would be important for a new griever to know? What would you want them to listen to this podcast and take away about grief?
You're not going crazy.
There you go.
And I think that the one thing that I wish I may have gone into therapy sooner is to have that takeaway. Because there were so many things that I was feeling, of course, emotionally and mentally, but also physically. We don't think about the physical aspects of it. And also, I just feel like my decision-making abilities were just completely just not there. Yeah. I just don't feel like I was making sense of life. But I guess in all of that, in all of those changes that were happening, I honestly felt like I was just losing my mind. And there was really no one to talk to about it. I didn't feel that anyone was feeling the same way. In some ways, I felt like I was having all of these strange out-of-body experiences, and I couldn't make sense of anything. And so to anyone who's even thinking about seeing a therapist or doing a group session, it will help you make so much sense of the experience that you're having, and to let you know that, one, you're not alone, and two, all of it's just, I don't know, it will all make sense in the end. How about that? And I don't know where the end is, but it will all make sense eventually. Right.
Well, that you're not going crazy, that comes up a lot. I mean, sometimes people will call and say, I need an appointment because I am going crazy, or they'll start telling you about, it's more than just that, like, I walked in a room and didn't know I was here. It's that, like, kind of on steroids, it's losing keys, not paying bills, just all the things that maybe, people kind of have down and they know what they need to do. It's just grief takes your brain, and just there's no more capacity for anything other than what happened. And so, yeah, I mean, we've even done a podcast episode on that, of just, am I going crazy with the thoughts in the brain? And I think that just, we have to be reminded that grief is all consuming. So it's physical, it's cognitive, it's emotional, it's behavioral, it's spiritual. And you definitely felt that. I hear that.
Yeah. So it was a relief almost to know that I wasn't just losing it.
Yeah. Well, I so appreciate you being here today and so willingly just sharing and being so vulnerable about your grief and your family. Is there anything else you felt like we should cover today or give some attention to?
No, I think that's it. I've had a great time with you.
Well, thank you. It's a joy to just hear your vulnerability, to hear your experience at the centers. I'm so glad that, you had all of those people in your path at the right time. And definitely it is an honor to us that people trust us. And so thank you for trusting us, and thank you for being here today. I I think this will be very meaningful and helpful to a lot of people, so thank you.
Awesome. I'm grateful to have been able to share.
Grief does heal. Let me say that again. Grief does heal. But like we've said, grief demands attention and care. It also needs support and patience. Remember that your grief is a reflection of your love. You are not alone. The world is full of many grievers like you. You can learn more about us at www.baptistgriefcenters.org. You can check out our YouTube channel, Baptist Centers for Good Grief. You can check out our podcast wherever you get your podcast. Also, know that you can reach out and let us know if there's a topic that you're interested in learning more about. You're welcome to email me at angela.kelly@bmhcc.org. That's angela.kelly@bmhcc.org. And remember, grief is real, big, better shared. We'll talk soon.